Well, Bore da, good morning and welcome to the Vale of Clwyd Climate Summit. Thank you all for logging in for what promises to be an intriguing morning of discussion and debate about some of the most important issues facing both our climate, our world and our beautiful locality here in North Wales. This year is of course a very important year for efforts to combat climate change. Not only does the global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic offer a unique opportunity for nations across the globe to build back greener, but the upcoming UN Conference of the Parties, COP26 conference in Glasgow this November, provides a crucial platform for global leaders to come together to find solutions to the pressing worldwide issue of climate change. Now, climate change is of course a global problem. It's not something that will affect just some of us or a threat that is limited in its effects. It will affect everyone, and that's why we need to make sure that the conversation on climate change includes everyone too. And that's one of the key reasons why I wanted to run this event today. I want to try and engage local people in these vital discussions and have been keen to bring together insightful voices on a variety of issues relating to climate change, so we can hear their take on pressing questions and what can be done to combat climate change both locally and globally. While, as I've said, climate change is a global problem that needs worldwide effort to address it, unfortunately, we will very obviously feel the effects of climate change here in the Vale of Clwyd. Climate change has the potential to heavily impact on our area, particularly by way of increased storm damage and flooding, the effects of which can be devastating, as we've sadly seen in recent years, arguably both in the east of Rhyl and in St Asaph. It's important for us to understand that we can all make a difference in the fight against climate change. While it's vital that world leaders come together and set ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions and reaching net zero, we can each do our bit to protect our air, our seas, and the natural environment that we all enjoy. Focusing back on this morning's event, I'm hopeful that our three panels will tackle some of the key issues regarding climate change and sustainability in our region and beyond. The first panel of the morning will focus on energy generation and will discuss how important it is for us to make our energy mix more sustainable, as well as looking at projects in the region that can help us lead in the field of renewable low-carbon energy. On this panel, we have David Sprake, Renewable Energy Programme Leader at Glyndwr University, Al Mather, Director at the Northwest Nuclear Arc, and John Egan, Northwest Regional Lead at Progressive Energy and HyNet. The second panel of the morning will look at sustainable development and growth. On this panel, we'll look at how vital it is that we plan for a more sustainable future through infrastructure, and how we can change our construction habits to better suit a low-carbon world. On this panel, we have Brian Jones, Lead Member for Waste, Transport and Environment at Denbighshire County Council, Colin Stuhlfelder, Senior Lecturer in the Built Environment at Glyndwr University, and Stephen Jones, Regional Coordinator at the Welsh Local Government Association and also Programme Coordinator at the Mersey Alliance. The final panel of the morning will focus on our personal environmental responsibilities and look at how the damaging effects of pollution not only affect our climate, but our health and the well-being of our natural environment too, aspects that are of the utmost importance to our everyday lives. On this panel, we'll hear from Joseph Carter, who is Head of Devolved Nations at the British Lung Foundation and Asthma UK, from Adrian Lloyd-Jones from the North Wales Wildlife Trust, and from Jonathon Dawes, the first member of the Welsh Youth Parliament for the Vale of Clwyd. And throughout the event, you'll be able to submit questions to the panellists regarding the issues they have raised, and we'll look to put some of those to the panels at the end of each discussion. Regrettably, we may not be able to ask every question, but we'll try to get in as many as we can, so please do contribute using the Q&A button below. This is the first summit of this type that I've held and also the first Zoom webinar, so if there are any teething or technical problems, please do bear with me and my team. I hope you all enjoy the discussions this morning, and without further ado, we will attempt to move on to our first panel. So the first panel is energy generation, and as I mentioned earlier, the general theme of this panel is on reducing the carbon footprint of our energy sources and reducing our dependence on dirty fossil fuels. We'll discuss both local aspects on this issue, including the great opportunities for our region to lead in the area, as well as looking to explore the opportunities for progressive progress in this area at COP26. First of all, I'd like to welcome two our panelists here to discuss issues surrounding energy generation. So a big hello to Al, David and John. Each of the panelists will now give a short introduction about themselves and what their organisation does in relation to energy generation. So first up, I think we have Al, if you're ready.
Good morning. Thank you, James.
Morning.
And thanks for inviting me today. It's great to be here. So I'm just going to talk for 2 minutes about the Northwest Nuclear Arc. The Northwest Nuclear Arc is one of the most important nuclear clusters in Europe. It is the jewel in the crown of the nuclear industry in the UK. The Northwest Nuclear Arc covers the whole geography, as you can see behind me, from Cumbria all the way down through Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield and into North Wales. It is an end-to-end nuclear system. We do everything of the whole nuclear cycle within this very compact geography. The only thing we don't do is mine uranium. And in that way, it is unique. The cluster is built on a huge industrial heritage of nuclear R&D, science, engineering, fuels enrichment, fuels manufacturing, energy production, and waste and decommissioning. The Northwest Nuclear Arc is a group of volunteers from the academia, from industry, from the nuclear sites, from local government and economic development agencies, and through business membership organisations and the Welsh Government. And our purpose really is to make visible this nuclear asset, and to make it clear and to share messages about how important this is for clean energy generation, for tackling climate change, and for some of the levelling up agenda that the government is talking about at the moment. If you will know that most of our nuclear sites are located on the peripheries of some of our most disadvantaged coastal communities. And industrial development there through nuclear technology has been essential for creating high value, sustainable jobs for young people, high interesting careers and exciting opportunities for local communities. Just to give you a few facts about the Northwest Nuclear Arc, we contribute £4.6 billion of GVA to the UK economy each year. We employ 50,000 people within our sector. We have within our geography 44% of all nuclear researchers in universities in the UK. We can provide 50% of the sites in the UK for new large build and 75% of the sites for small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors, which are new nuclear technologies which could be really useful in the fight against climate change. We have got a challenge though in the UK. We have 8 nuclear sites, nuclear power stations producing 1/5 of the UK's electricity, and 7 are due to shut down in the next decade. And so really it's a call for arms, a call for action from policymakers and from the industry itself to gather ourselves together to make the case for nuclear and land new nuclear investments within our geography, which I've said before, will fight climate change and bring high value jobs to our communities in the northwest of England and North Wales. There's lots that nuclear can do. It's not just about generating electricity for the grid. Nuclear energy would be critical in decarbonisation of industry and potentially for district heating and the co-production of hydrogen and synthetic fuels. So we see a real future there. And also, don't forget that nuclear does provide vital nuclear medicine support, and there is some interesting developments being put forward around the site at Trawsfynydd in that respect. So I think I'll get on to talk about Wales-specific sites and developments later, and I'm just going to leave it there for now. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Al. That's a fantastic introduction, and as you say, we will cover many more points shortly. So I have David next on my list. David, if it's okay to go over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Really appreciate you asking me to speak today. I am a senior lecturer and programme leader at Wrexham Glyndwr University. I teach a wide variety of subjects around the subject of renewable energy and climate change with undergraduate and postgrad students. So I teach about how renewable energy engineering, and that's all the types of renewable energy, can be incorporated into the grid with energy storage, and how that smart grid will be able to meet the demands of the country. So everything really around low carbon energy systems, including the load that's going to be put on the electricity system by electrical vehicle charging in the rollout of that. So I research everything to do with climate change and renewable energy. And I've also got a knowledge transfer partnership with a local company just outside Wrexham called Dragon Drilling. And we're looking into an innovative new way to test ground source heat pumps. And that's me.
Thank you very much, David. And John, HyNet, Progressive Energy.
Good morning, James. Thanks very much for the invitation to come to this event. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and share. So, little introduction. So I'm John Egan. I'm the Northwest lead at a company called Progressive Energy. We're the leaders of the HyNet project, HyNet Northwest project. We're also involved in several other clean energy projects around the country. I think the context for this is very much as James set it, is, there's a climate crisis and there is no single answer to that. There's multiple pieces to the solution. And sometimes I think we can hear in the media, or we can hear certainly on social media, a particular answer. And as long as we do that, then all's good. The truth is, this is the most complex problem humanity has ever faced, I think. And we've got to work all sorts of pieces to the solution. And some of those are behavioral, and some of those are technical, and some of those are social. And so, whilst today we're going to talk, particularly this morning, about the energy system, and I'll talk about HyNet project that I'm passionate about, as James will know. He's going to have to shut me up at some point. I don't want for a minute anyone to think, therefore I'm saying that's the only answer, because it's not. We need a broad suite of solutions, and we all need to engage in them and be open to them. And in fact, one of the things I find most sad is when I see some of the stuff on social media of people arguing one solution against another, because actually we're wasting our time, because the urgency of the problem in front of us is incredible. We've done a fabulous job in the UK of setting a net zero goal of 2050, but actually it's far too late. We need to be taking CO2 out of our economy, out of our emissions now. And so there's a real urgency, and we all need to feel that urgency. The analogy I often use in my mind is, if your house is on fire, you don't debate the fire extinguisher versus the fire blanket. You use them both. You use everything, right? And that's the way we have to look at this. So HyNet is a great project. It's not the only solution. It's a piece of it. So please don't hear it that I'm saying it's the only solution. HyNet is about getting on and actually making material reductions in our CO2 emissions from industry, from transport, from heat, from power generation. It's about getting on and doing it. As you can imagine from the name, it's primarily about hydrogen, so switching ourselves away from the fossil fuels that we burn in our homes, in our industry, that releases CO2, switching that to hydrogen, which doesn't release CO2 when it's burnt. It also involves carbon capture and storage, a critical technology. I'm sure many people saw what the Committee on Climate Change said yesterday, which was using Al's phrase, a call to arms, right? It's, come on, folks, we've got to get on with this. Enough talking, let's start doing. And all of these technologies we need to be getting on with. Recognize that some of them are new and different, but that's not a reason not to make progress. And the truth is, we can't afford to wait. We need to progress. And the other thing I'll say is, HyNet as a project actually is really important for the economy of our region. So fundamentally, if we don't start decarbonizing our industry, it's going to become too expensive to manufacture in this country. Our industry will go elsewhere. It'll keep manufacturing, it'll keep producing CO2, but it'll do it elsewhere in the world, which doesn't solve the problem. So actually we see HyNet as critical as well to actually securing and sustaining our industrial base here whilst getting on and cleaning up our environment. So I'll pause there because otherwise I'll just keep going, but I'm sure we'll have lots more debate.
Thank you, John. Well, there's plenty of time to keep going. We have half an hour left of this panel. Just to remind all of those in attendance, please send your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll try and get you in as we can. So we've already heard about hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, nuclear power. Obviously of great interest in North Wales also is wind, offshore wind in particular. Further developments expected on that front, and potentially tidal energy too. But Al, you started off, so we'll come back to you first. Nuclear, of course, is great in that it provides predictable energy, doesn't it? In a way that perhaps wind doesn't and solar doesn't, certainly in this country. How important is that in terms of this country's energy supply in the future, bearing in mind that we're switching all of our coal power stations off, for instance?
Thanks, James. So the climate is changing, and we've experienced that over the last couple of years in terms of wind and the dry summers and that type of thing. So I think what we're saying from the North West Nuclear Arc is nuclear is part of this jigsaw that John referred to. We need to use every tool in the box in order to address some of these climate issues and to reach that carbon net zero target, and having reliable nuclear power as part of the mix is going to be really helpful, because it's going to keep a steady source of energy available to the grid. And also, I think in the future, hopefully, it can provide, it can accelerate the production of these other low carbon energy sources, such as hydrogen and synthetic fuels, particularly with the more advanced reactor designs, such as high temperature gas reactors, for example. They can produce hydrogen at double the rate that a standard nuclear power station could, because of the it's a thermochemical process. I'm not a chemist, but essentially we are saying that we've got our nuclear heritage skills, we've got our nuclear sites already, we've got an exceptional workforce. We used to be world leaders in nuclear technology and design. We have the chance now to be part of this energy transition mix, working with other low carbon energy sources, but providing that very vital, reliable, all consistent support to the grid, and reliable, consistent, accessible energy to produce other forms of low carbon energy. And that's why nuclear is really important as part of the mix.
Thank you very much. Now, clearly, from the point of view of the Vale of Clwyd, we look to the east and we see the nuclear arc there and going up north to Cymru. But to the west, of course, is Anglesey, where Wilfer Nuclear Power Station was. What's the latest situation with Wilfer Newydd, the idea that we have a new nuclear power station there, and possibly Trawsfynydd also? Hitachi's clearly pulled out. I know there are discussions possibly with the Americans. Are you optimistic? Will it be what we first thought it would be, or will it be a different type of a smaller modular reactor?
Well, I think talking to local stakeholders, the stakeholders consider Wilfer to be the best site in Europe for large gigawatt, large build power station of nuclear power. So I think the stakeholders are quite keen for a large build to go there. It doesn't mean to say that there isn't room for small modular reactors, which are just basically mini nuclear reactors, which can be built on nuclear licensed sites. But I think in the future, some of the developers are hoping that these small modular reactors will be able to go elsewhere. There could be opportunities for co-production of hydrogen at Wilfer as well. And I know there's been some interest from another small modular reactor designer, NuScale, to do a kind of a wind, hydrogen, small modular reactor development. So I think it's all to play for, but my understanding from the local stakeholders and what they want is that they would want a large build power station, because that would be a once in a generation large infrastructure project for North Wales, which would literally deliver thousands of jobs during the construction phase, hundreds of permanent jobs. It would power 5 million homes, and it would give us 60 years of emissions-free clean energy. So it's up to them, it's up to the stakeholders. But if you talk to the technical people as well, and the engineers, they see that site as being very, very, very good for a large build. So let's hope that that can happen, and that local stakeholders want that to happen, and the government will get behind it. Because like Moorside, there's been a couple of attempts at building large scale nuclear power on these sites, and it can be very disappointing and crushing for the local community and supply chain when it doesn't come off. So the government's got to deliver this. If you look at France, for example, the French government got behind a fleet approach to building nuclear reactors, and that's why they're one of the greenest economies in Europe. So we have to make a decision here about that Wilfer site, but it's got to be from the local stakeholders and what they want. But I think that if the government can get behind this new consortium, if they can make the numbers stack up, because nuclear has to make the numbers stack up, we've got to get faster, we've got to get cheaper. I would hope there would be a large build there. Regarding Stuhlfelder, I think that's an absolutely ideal site for R&D and for small modular and advanced modular reactor development. And I know that there's a new company being formed, Cymru, which is there to develop that site along with local stakeholders. And there's lots of interesting things that could happen there, such as medical isotope research reactor and that type of thing. So a Trouse is a smaller site, better for the smaller advanced modular reactors. Maybe Wilfer is better really for the large scale build, and I think that would deliver a lot of value to the people of North Wales and really contribute to our fight against climate change and delivery of net zero. So I think Wales has got it all, basically. Wales could have the lot. It could have large build, it could have small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, a research facility at Bangor University looking at thermal hydraulics. It could be there. It's so close to the HyNet local, that area. It could contribute to hydrogen co-production, synthetic fuels. And it's got the skills, the heritage, and support of the Welsh government actually behind it.
Thank you, Al. Final question to you for now is from Councillor Rachel Flynn, and she's concerned about nuclear waste.
Yeah.
I'm sure many people are. That's the one disadvantage many people see. Can you just touch on that quickly for us, please?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd like to say is no one's died from being in contact with stored nuclear waste. However, we have 7 million people who die a year from being in contact with air pollution. The second thing to say is a lot of the issues around nuclear waste are around the legacy waste, which is basically at Sellafield. And that was created from the 1950s onwards during the development of nuclear materials for the arms race, and then moving into the generation of electricity. So there is some legacy waste at Sellafield. It's about 4.5 million cubic meters, so about three times the size of Anfield of nuclear waste. The vast majority of that is low level and intermediate waste, which can be stored very safely. I would like to say that actually compared to solar panels globally, by 2050, there's going to be 80 million tons of solar panels, which will be waste from solar panels, which is toxic as well. So what I'm saying is, yes, there is nuclear waste. A lot of the nuclear waste issues we have in the UK is about the legacy waste. The new waste will need management, but every industrial process creates waste. The nuclear sector has always cleaned up after itself. It's always stored its waste. It's never pumped it into the sky. So I think an honest conversation about waste is really good, and I think we should talk about it. There's some options for storage of waste, a geological disposal facility, and there are communities in the UK who have been asked would they like one of these facilities in their areas at the moment, and there have been quite a lot of interest from, I think, 2 or 3 community groups quite interested in that. So yes, it produces waste. Most of the problem waste is a legacy waste. It's not produced by new nuclear power. New nuclear power does produce waste. I would say there's quite a lot of R&D looking at new nuclear power and how to reuse and recycle waste into the advanced modular reactors designs. So yes, there's waste. Let's talk about waste. No one's died from being in contact with stored nuclear waste. Lots of people die from being in contact with air pollution. And I would say that actually every form of energy production, you have got a waste issue. So it's just about how you manage it safely, securely, and you're open about it. In the Netherlands, you can actually visit the stored nuclear waste facility. It's an art gallery, it's got a visitor centre. So I think we need to start normalising the waste issue. And it's a really good question. And thanks for that, Rachel. And now I've got like a briefing paper that I'd be happy to circulate around James afterwards, which is written by academics. So it's not an industry perspective, it's a proper scientific perspective on nuclear waste, and I'm happy to share that.
Please, that would be great. And then anyone who wants me to send that to them, please email me and I'll send it back. Thank you very, very much, Al. David, if we could come to you next. Priorities for COP26 in terms of energy generation, what do you think they are, please?
Thank you, James. So the engineering and the technology to make the world carbon neutral is there today. I think the problem is how fast we can do it and what the drivers are to make that actually happen. And the first thing I'd like to see discussed is a global carbon tax, where the polluter, the people who produce the most carbon dioxide, will pay some kind of tax. Now, the problem with this is some countries will not sign up for that. And what do we do about those? Well, we can put some kind of carbon tax on the imports from that country to make it unsustainable for them to carry on as they are. And in that way, put pressure on countries who won't sign up for it. So that would be the first thing, a global carbon tax that's enforced and real. The second thing I'd really like to see is to have a look at the subsidies paid to fossil fuel companies. At the moment in the UK, they're the highest in Europe. And also they're much more than the subsidies given to renewable energies. And the subsidies to fossil fuels are largely hidden to the general public, whereas the subsidies to renewable energies are quite sort of out there in the press. So according to an EU Commission report in 2019, the UK gave £8.3 billion in subsidies to fossil fuel companies. So I'd like to see that looked at and perhaps shifting some of those subsidies to more low carbon types of energy production. The third thing I'd like to see is there's a technology I call carbon engineering, and that is sure we can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, but what's going to happen to all the stuff we've already put there? And there's machines now being created that can suck carbon dioxide out the air, and it's a machine, if you like, that's imagine an office block, and it's equivalent to tens of millions of trees. And I had a student do a project where if these were placed around the globe at various different places, we could start reducing the carbon dioxide levels just by taking carbon dioxide out. And that carbon dioxide can actually be used as a fuel or stored under the ground. And for that reason, I think some fossil fuel companies are actually investing in that. So them are the three most important things I can see. But with this paradigm shift that's coming, there's tremendous opportunities for not only North Wales, but the whole of the UK.
Very good. Now, there's often concerns raised about other countries' contributions. So, for instance, China building new coal power stations. How successful do you think we can be at COP26 or in the near future in terms of phasing out coal on a global basis?
So I'm not an optimist and I'm not a pessimist, I'm a possibilist. And there's a great website called End Coal, and what it tracks is the number of new coal-fired power stations being built and the ones that are closing down, the ones that are actually in the investment stage. And it has predicted that probably the last coal-fired powered power station is going to be built probably in the next few years, because it's just unsustainable when we look at the cost of air pollution, the future cost of climate change, and also the fact that other fuels such as nuclear, wind and solar are much cheaper depending on the resources in that country. So I think coal will phase out gradually, just naturally, because there's other better technologies.
Okay, really good progress in this country, of course, because we've often gone, I think, weeks, is it fair to say, with no use of coal for the national grid? And how important do you think energy security and reliability of energy supply is in terms of discouraging countries from going down the green route?
That's a fantastic question, James. So the first thing I'd like to say is, when we look at the UK, we import some of our gas and our oil from places like Russia and the Middle East, and that's not that energy secure, in my opinion. But if we look at the alternatives, such as nuclear, hydrogen, and the renewable energies, so with wind energy, it's very sporadic and unpredictable, well, reasonably predictable, but random. With solar energy, it peaks in the summer months during the day, obviously, but when the sun isn't shining, there's no electricity production. So we call these non-dispatchable types of energy. We can't switch them on and off when we want. We've just got to use them when we're there. But that's a fantastic resource to turn into hydrogen, to use as a fuel when we're producing too much. There is hydro energy, and we can switch that on and off whenever we want to. So if we incorporate all these different types of variable energy with hydro and with some energy storage and some nice steady nuclear energy, we could actually make that work really more reliable, I think, than the energy system we've got now. And the engineering skills and technology is there to do that.
And finally, for now, I have a very interesting question from Michael Lovegrove. What do you think about central versus distributed energy generation? And is distributed generation an untapped resource, considering all the unused domestic and commercial roof space available for solar panels, thermal or local wind, either turbine or vortex systems? And then he's suggesting that central generation can focus on national infrastructure energy demand. Others on the panel may have a quick view on that as well. In fact, I'll hand up.
Yeah, I think that's hitting the nail on the head, and it's something I hope that gets addressed at COP. I don't know whether you're aware that actually in Cumbria, Cumbria was home to the first community part-owned wind farm called Big Wind, and 2 years ago, the Cumbrian community around Meanmore fully bought out a 6.9 megawatt wind production plant, and they raised 2.8 million to do that. So it's 100% community owned, and I think that is fantastic. And I would really support that distributed v state funded and centralized model, and I think that's the way to go, not just for the UK, but to address some of these other issues around energy access and security elsewhere in the world. So 600 million African people do not have access to energy. That's according to the African Union. 400,000 suffer or killed or suffer injury through using cooking fuels, which are not safe, every year. So I think there's lots of issues around energy security, which is about access to energy, but also around the political and the social aspects of that. And I think that kind of the central delivery model with distribution into community-owned ventures is definitely the way to go, not only in the UK, but elsewhere in the world, in order to give fair and equitable access and control to local communities of their energy sources. I was recently in the Gambia, where I used to live, and there's actually a huge ship in the middle of the Gambia River with a diesel generator on it. It's crazy. Why is that the case when it is really hot all the time and sunny? So these things need to be addressed, and I think that communities can do those themselves through putting pressure on their governments to put the right policy frameworks in place, not just in the UK, but elsewhere in the world. So a great question. Thank you for that. Thanks for letting me chip in.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, great question, Mike. So just to make it clear, what a decentralised energy system is instead of having just power stations dotted here and there around the country, we have many more very much smaller power producing sort of areas. So they're much more evenly distributed around the country, and there's many more of them. And the massive advantage with that is that when we try to transport that electricity, it doesn't have to travel so far along the wires if it's pretty close to us where it's being produced. And that's a massive advantage to the national grid. And it's much more efficient because when we pass electricity down a wire, it loses some of its efficiency. So I am totally in favour of a decentralised system, and I think it is the way to go. And local energy systems such as the Colin hydro project and a few other local projects which are owned by the community and actually make money from that through a share system are really brilliant. Everybody benefits.
Great. So I think we should move on to John, if that's okay. John, we have a few questions that have come in about hydrogen, I can see. But can you give us an idea, first of all, where this country is in comparison to perhaps others in Europe or the rest of the world on hydrogen technology at the moment, please?
Yeah, I'm not going to claim to be an international expert on this. I think the world as a whole is recognizing hydrogen is a very good fuel because when it's burned, it releases water. When you burn hydrogen, that's its great advantage. And you know, we have huge amounts of resource that fundamentally can provide that. So I think we see elsewhere in Europe a lot of interest, certainly in Germany and in the Netherlands at the moment. We are also seeing a lot of interest for production of hydrogen in Australia and consumption of hydrogen in Japan. And I think what's really interesting with a lot of that is you've got to recognize each country already has a different energy system. So how integrated they are. The UK has a phenomenally integrated and resilient energy system. You know, I think we sometimes forget that. When anyone on the call who has their home connected to gas, when did your gas supply ever stop? That's, yeah. Does your car have that level of resilience? Does, you know, it's a phenomenally resilient system. And even, you know, electricity goes off occasionally, but it's still pretty good, right? So I think we sometimes forget what a phenomenally resilient energy system we have. Not all countries have the same structures, the same integration. And also, one of the things that we've got in the UK is access to an awful lot of coastline, an awful lot of gas fields and oil fields that have been depleted that we're going to be able to use for carbon capture and storage, which not all countries have got that. You know? Particularly if you're landlocked, you don't have access to a lot of coast, right? So direct comparison is not always all that useful. So take Germany. Germany, for example, has very little coastline, very, very little opportunity to do carbon capture and storage. So therefore is thinking about hydrogen in a different way from the way we are. Maybe I should explain that. Two ways to make hydrogen. You can split natural gas or you can split water. Splitting water requires a lot of renewable energy. Splitting natural gas produces byproduct CO2 that needs to be stored with carbon capture and storage. They're known as blue hydrogen when you split natural gas and green hydrogen when you split electricity, split water. The reality is we need both. The technology for blue is much more available at a much larger scale and much lower cost. So we see that happening faster, building up the infrastructure as so-called green comes along and we get more and more renewable power. Germany's taking a different position because it can't really do the blue hydrogen in the same way. Countries with lots of solar will take a different position. So direct comparisons are not always that helpful. Likewise, the electricity system in different countries is very different. Al mentioned France earlier. France has, you know, a very, very high percentage of nuclear power. So very different from our energy system, which has been, you know, heavily gas-fired over recent years and is moving to increasing amounts of offshore wind, some onshore wind as well. Okay, so, you know, not all exactly the same, but I think lots of countries looking at hydrogen as a clear route. And in the Middle East, there are some big projects coming along as well. In the UK, what I would say is a lot of recognition from government and industry that hydrogen is absolutely a key component. If you go to the 10-point plan published last year, hydrogen, is one of the big components of the 10-point plan. Government wants to have 5 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2030, which is a pretty chunky amount. Actually, I think most of us think we could do more than that. I think we can be more ambitious and probably need to be more ambitious than that. But it's good to have some targets that we're aiming towards. The hydrogen initially in the UK will be produced in big industrial clusters, and HyNet being one of those projects, because there you get a large amount of demand in one area. So you can build up that infrastructure and that production capacity quickly and then grow from there. Okay, and that's why we designed HyNet around developing hydrogen at scale, first and foremost for industry, because we can take out, roughly 25% of our CO2 emissions come from industry. So, large amount of emissions to go after, and they're clustered in the UK in areas like the northwest of the UK, northeast Wales and northwest England. So that's very much why we've designed projects around that. And then we see that hydrogen over time being used increasingly beyond industry, so for flexible power generation or dispatchable power generation, and for heating homes and transport. Yeah. But build up the infrastructure using industry, if you like, as the anchor demand.
Thank you, John. And now I can see continuing questions coming in, including from Andy Bilcliffe, who of course represents Morelice tidal flow project in Anglesey. And Andy, if you are able to say a few words, we'll very happily put you on screen. So if you could kindly let me know through the messaging, or very happily do that. But Andy, you raised the issue of energy storage. So hydrogen is one mechanism of storing energy. There are, of course, others, battery, presumably hydroelectric. John, what's your argument over the various different types of storage available?
Yep. So again, same point as before. We shouldn't be trying to down select to one technology. Hydrogen has the great advantage that it can be stored in bulk, just like natural gas is. So probably one of the hidden secrets in Cheshire, where I live, that not everyone knows, is we've got the UK's biggest store of natural gas. People probably don't realise that. If you know the area between Northwich and Middlewich in Cheshire, there's large numbers of salt caverns under there storing natural gas. Yeah, nobody knows about it. You just kind of see the fields, and if you really looked hard, you might notice a few pipes in those fields. Okay, UK's biggest store of natural gas under there. And the reason it's there is because there's a big salt field that the chloralkali industry has mined out that salt by what's called solution mining for many years. And if you mine that out and make the right shape of cavern, you can use it to store gas afterwards, after you've taken the salt out. Right? Very efficient. About 500 meters below the surface, something like that. Same technology, absolutely perfect for storing hydrogen as well. Why? The reason is because salt has this amazing capacity of what's called self-healing. So, the salt is effectively the rock that's there. And if you get cracks in it, it heals itself. So that's why it self-seals. It keeps the gas in and would keep the hydrogen, or will keep the hydrogen in. So our partners Innovin are developing a project there for creating new caverns to store hydrogen. Why is that so important? 2 reasons. So one is that resilience I talked about before. We all want energy there at the moment we want it. Okay, whether it's gas or whether it's electricity, as soon as we turn on the boiler or turn on the light switch, we want it to be there. So storage gives us resilience. But really the real value of this comes with, David talked before about dispatchable and non-dispatchable power. So renewables are fabulous, but they are intermittent, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, right? And we all want our power to come from renewables as much as possible. But if it's a still night, there's not going to be a lot of renewable power coming from our wind farms and solar. So what we can do is use gas-fired power stations, but running on hydrogen instead of natural gas. So we store the hydrogen in salt caverns, and then when we need that electricity to be generated because the intermittent renewables are not generating, we release the hydrogen to the power station. And some of you may have seen just on Wednesday, our friends at Rock Savage Power Station, Intergen, who operate that gas-fired power station, have announced their participation in HyNet, that they want to convert the power station ultimately to a fully zero carbon power station using hydrogen. Okay, so this is a perfect example of moving from nice theory to actually get on and do it, because that's what we need to do. We need to be getting on and doing this stuff now. Yeah. So again, perfect example of what I was saying is that isn't the whole solution on its own. It's part of that overall mix along with nuclear and with renewables. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I can see Andy is happy to say a few words to us. So just while we get that sorted and get him on the screen, there are two questions, John, from the audience. One from Paul Toll about whether clean hydrogen can be produced economically, and another from Dewi Owens about using hydrogen in heavy goods vehicles, trains, aeroplanes. How likely is that, and how close are we to that? And then we'll move over to Andy for a few words, if that's okay.
Sure. So let me take the first one, because that is a really, really important question.
Literally a few minutes, though.
Oh, go on. Well, I'll try. Yeah, fundamentally making hydrogen, however we make it, blue or green or from nuclear or whatever, will be more expensive than natural gas. Okay, that is a challenge we all have to deal with. And I think this really comes to the heart of the problem in front of us, is decarbonising our energy system as a whole is going to cost money, and we all have to pay for it. Okay. Now, the alternative is to do nothing, and the costs of doing nothing are going to be an awful lot worse. So we have to do it, and I think, you know, it's up to all of us, and I'm including politicians in there, James, is all of us is have an honest conversation about how we pay for this. Yeah. Now, actually, we've all been paying for clean electricity generation for some time. Many of us may not have spotted it on our electricity bills. There is a significant piece on there that pays for offshore wind and other renewable energy. And effectively, we're going to have to do the same with hydrogen, with carbon capture and storage. The way to say it is those costs need to be spread across all of us, because we all are going to get the benefit from cleaning up our energy system. So let's not try and pretend we can do this without cost, because we can't. Okay? Yeah, we've all lived with the benefit of very low cost energy for a long time and not paid the cost of damaging our environment. And it's now up to us, our generation and subsequent generations, is to pay for that by cleaning up our energy system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, John. Now, Andy, over to you, if I may, because offshore wind is really important to North Wales. Obviously, we've had Rhyl Flats, North Hoyle, Burbo Bank, Gwynter Moor, which is about to expand to Awella Moor. There are 3 new sites further out towards the Isle of Man that the Crown Estates have allocated. And then in terms of tidal, I know you're very involved in the flow of tide off Anglesey through the Morelice project. There's also, of course, a huge desire for tidal range to be exploited, and whether that's at Mostyn Docks or between Colwyn Bay and Prestatyn with a lagoon. Could you give us an idea of some of your thoughts as well, if that's okay?
Well, thank you very much, James. I wasn't actually expecting to talk now, and it's a bit of a surprise. I've been on the presenting end, but I think it's really important that we recognise that North Wales is ideally placed for this new revolution in energy that has to happen before 2050. You know, like you say, we've got the offshore wind farms, we've got the Morelice project, which is just awaiting determination on a 240 megawatt scheme to extract energy from the tides. I'm also involved with the tidal range opportunity off Rhyl and Prestatyn. But Menton Mon fits in with this local ownership thing that we're trying to achieve, certainly with Welsh Government. And Menton is involved with hydrogen as well, and we're talking with HyNet, and we're talking along the coast. But what we haven't really sort of said, you know, because we've got the ability to put in small nuclear reactors as well at Traws-Fyned, and we've got all the skill set from Wilver that needs to be redeployed as well. But we haven't really majored on the opportunity that North Wales delivers for us. We've got very skilled people. We've got people with an energy history going back to 1906 when Cumdilly Power Station was originally commissioned. So it's in our blood, and I'm saying that as an Englishman.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's good, isn't it? Because we need green energy, so it's an ideal opportunity for us to exploit, I hope. Diana has sent in a question here about using clean energy from tides. How do we ensure that we still have waves at the beach so we don't damage tourism industry, and that the sea creatures are protected?
Well, the Morelice project is tidal stream. That looks a bit like wind turbines, but placed within the column of water as it flows in and out. So yeah, the tides are the waves aren't affected by that at all. But you look at the amount of energy in the tide, in waves, it would be it'd be impossible to take a significant amount of the energy away.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not going to affect the waves.
No, they're pretty strong, aren't they? Now, we have literally 1 or 2 minutes left. Are there any burning issues that panel members wish to come back on? David?
I just wanted to say quickly about the costs of renewable energy. So these have, in the last 5 or 10 years, dropped enormously, 90% drop in the last 10 years in solar. And in the UK Parliament report, when it looked at predictions for energy costs in the future, 2025 levelised costs of energy, the cheapest forms of energy production are large-scale wind and solar. And that's a UK Parliament report. So I think there's a lot of misinformation spread about how expensive renewables are. They were 20 years ago. They're definitely not now, and they're in a lot of countries cheaper than fossil fuels.
Yeah, and certainly wind is now, I understand, very cheap, isn't it? And one of the arguments over the idea of harnessing tidal range is, of course, there's a big upfront cost, but of course, if it's there for 100 years, then the costs in total are not so great. Same with nuclear in many respects. David, you want to come back?
And just to note, those costs do not include the future cost of air pollution on our NHS and the future cost of climate change. So when you factor that in, renewable energy, nuclear and hydrogen, they're no-brainers.
Now, unfortunately, we're not going to get through all these questions that have come in, unless any of the panelists wish to desperately pick up one of them with an answer in a few words. I think we'll probably draw it to a close, this panel. So can I thank you all very, very much. You've given us a great insight into your respective areas of interest, and it just goes to show how much opportunity there is in this region to generate green energy. So we're very lucky, and from an environmental point of view, also from a jobs point of view and economic point of view, hopefully. So thank you all very, very much. You're welcome to stay and watch the remainder if you wish, or if you're busy people, which I know you are, and have other things to do, then I completely understand. So my team will switch over the panelists. Thank you all again. And we move on to the second panel, Sustainable Development and Growth. And for this panel, we'll focus on the issues relating to sustainable development. We'll be looking at how we must factor sustainability into future developments while updating existing infrastructure, as well as looking to comment on the potential opportunities for positive progress in this area at COP26. This topic is a particularly key area for our region. It's clearly vital that we continue to grow the North Wales economy, improve our local infrastructure and transport links, and provide opportunities for local people to find good jobs. However, how can we balance this need for growth and improvement with the need to reduce emissions and protect our environment? How can we ensure that the infrastructure we build is constructed and used in a sustainable way? And what role can local government and local people play in ensuring that we grow sustainably? To discuss these issues and the many aspects related to them, on this panel we'll be hearing from Stephen Jones of the Mersey Alliance and the Welsh Local Government Association, Colin Stuhlfelder, Senior Lecturer in the Built Environment at Glyndwr University, and Brian Jones, Denbighshire County Council Lead Member for Waste, Transport and the Environment. So as before, I'll ask each panellist to say a few words about themselves and what they do. And I think if we can start with Stephen, if you're there, please.
Thank you, James. I am here, and thank you for the invitation. It's a privilege to be able to join this event. I've been very impressed by the seriousness of the debate I've heard to date. I work for the Welsh Local Government Association, and in the last year or so, I've been working on secondment with the Mersey Alliance. So my Welsh Local Government Association work is supporting a body called the North Wales Regional Leadership Board, which consists of leaders and chief executives of the 6 North Wales councils. And prior to that, I did a lot of work with the North Wales Economic Ambition Board. I was effectively the secretary to that board from 2016 to the beginning of 2019 and put a lot of effort into the North Wales Growth Deal. Working with the MDA, I've been supporting the fiscal stimulus package proposal, and I'm the secretary of the board of Growth Track 360. And my commitment for the Mersey Alliance and Growth Track 360 is to work, to promote the interests of the cross-border economy, represented by Wrexham, Flintshire, Cheshire West and Chester and Wirral councils, and a very significant industrial manufacturing cluster in that area. What both Growth Track 360 and the Mersey Alliance are doing is very relevant to decarbonising our economy and meeting our net zero commitments. The Growth Deal made major proposals around the nuclear industry and also trying to develop smart grids. The MDA essentially is promoting hydrogen as one of its core proposals in the fiscal stimulus package, and that's to accelerate the deployment of the HyNet project. And that's critical because the North East Wales industrial cluster are heavy energy users, and we need to be able to transfer their production methods away from carbon sources to low carbon. The fiscal stimulus package also will help with decarbonisation targets by promoting active travel. One of the major proposals is for an integrated active travel network across the 4 boroughs, which would help people get out of their cars and cycle or walk to work, and it would also be a leisure facility. And there are also proposals to boost the role of public transport. And I think the North Wales Metro is a critical component of trying to give an alternative to the car and reduce carbon emissions in the way forward. We also are looking at helping companies innovate, and that will include decarbonising their operations. So we've got a business challenge fund with a green skills element that will help companies reduce their carbon emissions. And we are also looking to help engineering companies diversify out of automotive and aerospace, where there are current demand problems, to support offshore wind. And obviously, North Wales is closely interrelated to the cross-border economy. Thousands of jobs in Chester, Wirral, along the M53 corridor, and on Deeside Industrial Park are taken by people along the North Wales coast and other parts of North Wales. And it's absolutely essential that we look at the health of that employment cluster, which gives us high value jobs with good wages. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Stephen. And Colin, if I can come over to you next, please.
Okay. Stephen, I think I might be that cross-border person. I travel across 3 trains from Liverpool to Wrexham to get to work. It's quicker to get to London, but I'm definitely the cross-border person. Okay, so my name's Colin Stillfelder. I am the program leader for architectural design technology at Wrexham Glyndwr University. And sustainability really is core to everything that we do in the built environment across our courses, which are architectural design technology, construction management and civil engineering. So very much in line with most of the growth plans for North Wales, it's civil engineering and housing and construction that seem to be focused on. I actually have a background in social housing as well, and really the term sustainability and growth has various different meanings in different parts of the construction industry. And where I worked in North Liverpool, the fantastic estates built in the 1930s, great houses, tree-lined avenues, no services. And so when we're talking about sustainability going into the future, we need to make sure we don't repeat those kind of mistakes. You know, you build great green houses with no services and no access, and you'd think we've unpicked those problems over the last 70 odd years, but there are new housing estates being built all over the UK at the moment. Not social housing, you know, for open market sale, where if you don't own a car, then there's no way that you could live there sustainably. So I think it's really good that we're having these kind of discussions and really understanding what sustainability does mean as well. So within our team at the university, our understanding of the built environment and in the construction industry is that both in the design, the building, the operation and the disposal of buildings, we are one of the biggest contributors to the carbon footprint of most industrial countries, and Wales is no exception. So there's real responsibility on our sector, from infrastructure to housing, etc., to really understand how we can do this better. And so that's really core to what we're trying to do. And that's not just us as professionals and as educators and the university and the professional bodies that back us up. That's clear in all government strategies of whatever nature they are, that the construction industry has a big role to play. So some of the things we're trying to get our students to understand and the questions we are now routinely expecting them to do. So it's not that we have a project, as we might have done 20 years ago, make sure this building is green. It's now an emphasis that everything they do in their education and then through into their careers must appreciate that. And it's questions around how far do materials travel to a site? You know, where are you sourcing your materials? What do you do with those materials when the building is pulled apart? Can you do it in such a way that you can reuse them and actually program them in at the start? There are questions around economics. You get charged VAT if you retrofit a building. You don't get charged VAT if you drop that building and build it again on the same footprint. And that's a challenge that we need to address, and inconsistency. So it's a fascinating subject area, and hopefully I can be of some use to you today.
Thank you very much, Colin. And Brian, please, if you could say a few words. You could, that would be great.
That's not a very good start. I thought the host was unmuting me. So yeah, thank you for that, James, and thank you for having me here this morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Jones, and I'm the Denbighshire County Council Cabinet Member. And within my portfolio, as James explained, sits the waste and recycling, environmental and sustainable transport. Within that also comes flood risk management, and a host of other things. In respect of Denbighshire County Council, we did actually, in our corporate priorities back in 17, we did set a carbon emission reduction target of 15%, which we actually achieved a couple of years ago, and we all thought, you know, that was absolutely fantastic when we hit that goal. But at the same time, we declared a climate emergency in the county, and then realised that 15% was, as a reduction in carbon emissions, was perhaps something we shouldn't shout off the rooftops anymore. Now, what's happened in the 2 years since July 2019, when Denbighshire declared the climate emergency, as an authority, I think it's been acknowledged, we really moved forward and grasped the subject matter by the scruff of the neck. And if you remember that we're in the public sector here, what's happened in Denbighshire, without blowing the trumpet too hard here, but you'll pick up that I'm enthusiastic and right behind this agenda. We have come so far in a couple of years, you wouldn't associate that with the public sector environment. environment. It's more like the private sector. And so what have we done? Well, we declared the climate emergency. That might not be viewed as anything too great, but we followed that up, and we've put a strategy together, which was implemented in February of this year into the council's constitution, whereby we have committed to a net carbon zero and ecological positive organisation by 2030. We followed that up with an investment package over the next 3 financial years. It runs around about £9 million, and it's not going to solve the problem, but it is a demonstration that we're really taking this seriously, and we're determined to do something about it. Another really good thing that's come out in Denbighshire for me as a lead member is that we formed a climate change cross-party group, and I'm absolutely delighted that group came together, it worked together, and it's achieved a lot, and it's kept an eye on the officers, and we're actually going to continue that group to the end of this council. And it's been really great for me to get the support of the members within that group and to see them working together. And I think that's the key, that we must work together in local authorities, within the ranks, and then when you do work together, then you can really achieve. If you do need any information on the Denbighshire County Council climate change strategy, it is on the website there at denbighshire.gov.uk/climate change. It's a 9-year programme. There's a lot of detail in there. We've got some good officers in place. We're expanding the team in the next financial year to bolster up what we see as the objectives in that period. And there's a high level of confidence that we are going to do some good. And a last point from me, 2 years ago when we did declare the climate change emergency, I couldn't see how we would make a massive difference. But 2 years down the line, because of what has happened globally with the climate change subject matter, I can now see that in Denbighshire and the moves and the decisions and the priorities that we've got, we can get on board in the big picture, and locally, and it's just been mentioned a few moments ago, sustainable transport, that falls within my cabinet role. So I've been in numerous meetings now in the North Wales region, so I've got my fingers on the pulse with what's happening there. Flood risk management, we've actually pulled the group together there, which are working internally. It's worth a mention because this particular group, and a bit of a first, we've also got sitting on the group Natural Resources Wales, Welsh Water, the National Farmers Union, all these stakeholders coming together to look at flood risk management in Denbighshire. You know, that's really something that, again, 2 years ago, you wouldn't have thought would ever happen. So that's something good that in this developing Denbighshire County Council climate change strategy. So I'm starting to ramble on, James, so I'll have to come back for now. I've got a bank of other information if you ask me the right questions.
Good work, Brian. Thank you. So back to Stephen, I think, first in terms of questions. Just a reminder to all those watching to submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom, please. But Stephen, obviously you and I work closely on a number of issues that are of regional importance, particularly public transport. And when we're looking at sustainable development and growth, that's going to be key to improve public transport and ensure that it's decarbonised and green. Can you, for the benefit of the audience, explain what work is going on to push that agenda, if you might, please?
Yep. I think we've got a large range of initiatives in North Wales, and I think it is important to give formal thanks to you for the help that you give in Parliament for Growth Track 360, and how you've taken up the issues to help us get investment in the North Wales Coast Main Line. and we're aiming to have a lot more frequent services along the North Wales main line. 4 stopping services an hour, which is almost equivalent to turn up and go, plus 1 express train per hour. And we're also looking to provide an opportunity for freight movements along the North Wales coast at 1 train per hour. And that will help us with the North Wales Metro concept, because if each station then has connecting bus services with electric or hydrogen buses, which we're aiming for in the future, and active travel corridors between employment zones and residential areas, it will offer people an alternative to the car. The other issue that's outstanding there is the level of fares. And that principle of the Metro concept and the modal shift, helping people get to work. We're looking at the Wrexham-Liverpool line. That goes from 1 train per hour to 2 trains per hour in the near future. And the goal, again, is to get to 4 trains per hour every 15 minutes, running from Wrexham into Liverpool, where you've got 3 major employment zones along the line: Wrexham, Deeside, and then Birkenhead, Liverpool city centres. And we've put in a levelling up fund bid, which you kindly supported on behalf of your colleagues in North Wales and Cheshire West and Wirral, the members of Parliament. And that should enable us to run the trains by having investment in Deeside Station, which is a major employment zone. And we need to unblock, if you like, a bottleneck on the line where Hanson Freight are putting trains on and off the line and block the line for over an hour. So clearly you can't run passenger trains while there's a Hanson Cement train reversing up and down the line between Pennyforth and Deeside, where they turn around. So that's a really valuable example of small practical investments that will help with the switch to public transport. I think it's also worth mentioning that there's a lot going on with buses. Transport for Wales is working closely with the local authorities. I suspect Brian will have his finger on the pulse here, trying to look at a core network. The idea of sort of electric bikes and scooters at stations for that last mile that people can use is very important. And the other big investment that we're looking for to improve rail is Chester Station. That's absolutely essential to North Wales, that we have more services running through to go to Liverpool, Manchester via Warrington, and then down to Crewe. And we connect up to Northern Powerhouse Rail at Warrington and HS2 at Crewe. And they're vital investments where we've really benefited from your support to get in front of ministers and get advocacy. And you also picked up a difficult issue around access to Manchester, where we need to connect with the airport, which is the international gateway for North Wales for tourism and business. It's been a strong ask from business to improve access between North Wales and the airport. It's also very important to the universities, Bangor, Chester and Glyndwr, so that students can fly in from overseas and get straight down to their colleges. I think that's probably enough, because the Metro applies through all the boroughs, and that requires much better bus services that connect into rail.
Excellent. So there's hope for your commute yet, Colin, I think. And just in terms of aviation, clearly given that it's a green event, I think it's worth pointing out that although Manchester and Liverpool airports are key to the economic success of the region, there is some very good work going on at Airbus in North East Wales in relation to electric planes. We won't be hearing from them today, but a very interesting area. Stephen, just one more question about the Mersey Alliance financial stimulus package. Can you give a few words about how that's important to this agenda?
Yeah, I think it's critical because the challenge facing society is really moving from where we are now with carbon energy production, keeping as many jobs as we can in the industries that we have, like Airbus. You've got Tata Steel, you've got Toyota, and they need to move to new fuels, both for their production and for their products. And I think Tata Steel, have been that they're interested in sort of having much better steel construction prefabricated, so we can build more quickly without bricks, which need a lot of carbon. You've got Hanson Cement that will take advantage of the HyNet pilot and produce by hydrogen. We do need to give impetus to offshore wind, so that we've got suppliers and that we can create green jobs in this country for hydrogen, for offshore wind, and that's something the stimulus wants to promote. We've got that active travel network. I think reviving town centres, because I think Colin was talking about housing estates with no services. We are looking for different models, aren't we, from driving to the supermarket, for your weekly shop. We used to go out 3 or 4 times a week, maybe, to the baker, the butcher. I'm not sure we'll ever get back to that, but it's important to have options in town centres where people can shop differently, and I think that's something that's in our place proposals, to try and revive town centres and make them homes for independent producers, and more office and more homes in town centres from conversions. That should come out of the fiscal stimulus package. And there's that critical issue about helping companies on their path from being carbon emitters to being able to operate without carbon.
Fantastic. Thank you for that good summary of all the work going on regionally. Colin, if I can come to you. In fact, Dewi Owens has submitted a question, which is a good place to start, probably. So how much improvement are we seeing in the houses being built in becoming carbon neutral? What needs to be done over and above this, and how quickly does it need to be achieved?
Thank you. There has been a lot of progress. It's a strange one that people tend to not quite like how some of these houses look, but a lot more construction with wooden frame housing, which are then very rarely well insulated, and buildings that tend to breathe better, though there is another type of housing coming into North Wales based on conversations I've been having, based on a German system called Passive House, which is about a sealed building. And these are great, and these are based on ideas that have developed over the last 20 years around better insulation, better air quality, etc. However, one of the problems that we're going to start facing very, very soon is the fact that these houses, whilst they're very good at keeping us warm and keeping the air quality good, are not very good at keeping us cool. And regardless of I mean, if you can cast your minds back to 2018, when it was unbelievably warm, and I was actually in Dubai when that started, where they have air conditioning, and then I came back to the UK and had a worse time here than I did trying to get between buildings there. And I have a south-facing house. All the major rooms are south-facing, and so we do need to now shift from where we have been, which is quite good in terms of the progress towards carbon neutral, to beginning to think about how we deal with what's coming. Because Dewi, I noticed, says, how quickly can this, and when does it need to be achieved? It needs to be achieved about 30 years ago. And that's the reality of where we are with these things. And our approach is good in terms of carbon neutrality, but we now need to start thinking about how we make our houses coolable without necessarily fitting air conditioning into every single one of them, because that is definitely going to be where we will be in the next 5 or 6 to 10 years. We also need to be thinking better about what we do with our existing buildings. And actually in Wrexham, there was a project several years ago of attaching solar panels to all the relevant council housing where it pointed in the right direction. Obviously, you need to have a roof that's pointing south or southwest for that. So those are good. We need to probably start thinking about off-site construction to lower the carbon impact. So whether we can maybe think in North Wales if there's a way of creating a new industry instead of just relying necessarily on Scandinavian or the Germany, for example, for off-site construction, so that we bring buildings to sites pretty much ready to be fitted together, almost like a large Meccano set. Just reducing the build time, reducing the travel time, materials, etc. These are all opportunities for new industries in the region, be that, you know, across the border, as Stephen has been suggesting, or here in Wales, in the north, in the west, and the east of the north, for example, where there are areas where you could find spaces for creating those kind of industries. But I think the emphasis is, particularly for the audience listening, is, well, it's important to wait to see what construction companies and builders, etc., and government and scientists can come out with in terms of improving housing. I think it's really important that people start looking at what they can do with the existing homes in terms of how they operate them, smart meters, for example, how we all are responsible. And if you look at, for example, Welsh Government sustainability guidance under the Future Generations Act, the emphasis there is not just on companies and organisations, but it's on all of us to try and see what we can do to make things better. A water butt, for example. I would fit a water butt in every single house in Wales, just so that you are capturing water for future use. You know, some of it is very, very simple. Some of it is very scientific and technical that we can provide from our end.
Very interesting. So you mentioned water, but you mentioned smart meters. What kind of uptake is there currently of those measures? And do you think there's much more work required to promote them?
Smart meters are quite well promoted. And I know I've certainly had a Bluetooth water meter in my home for at least a decade, which means that my water bills are much lower, and you're actually much more, you notice when you've used a bit more water. Under the lockdown, for example, we were stuck at home, my water bill naturally went up. So those things are available, but those things should probably be mandatory, and there should be a program working with utility companies to replace old, outdated, like the gas meter outside my house, which, you know, is full of spiders. It needs to be updated. So there needs to be perhaps more coordination with the public and the private sector for that. But things like water butts is a simple thing that you can do yourself. I mean, I could, you know, share a link with you, James, about how you could create your own solar thermal panel in your back garden to warm water with just Coke cans. So the possibilities are out there, but it's this appreciation, I guess, that we can work with companies, we can work with utility companies, etc. But there are things that we can do ourselves as homeowners or tenants, etc., to make things better.
Very good. Can you give us an idea of the extent of the contribution of carbon emissions from buildings, from our homes, from businesses?
The last time I checked, which was in a lecture earlier this year, we were about 30%. So, and we were in Wales, we were one of the biggest contributors. And within that, if you then break that down, building operation costs are enormous, an enormous part of that. And, you know, I look at our own university campus building, it has huge flat roofs. Because the building is quite old, we can't quite support solar panels on it yet. But when we build new buildings, which we're trying to do at the moment as part of a regeneration project, they will be featuring all of those kind of technologies. So as we move forward into what we're doing with the existing stock, and I think there was a UK government report saying that about 50 or 60% of the buildings we need for the next 50 years are already built. So we're not actually looking at building masses of new buildings necessarily to meet this challenge. It's about what we can actually do with existing properties. So solar panels, green walls, green roofs, all this kind of stuff is important. We also probably need to look at how we can reduce how much concrete we're using, because concrete, if you're trying to break down how big the carbon footprint is in terms of building, then concrete is a huge issue. But we're also facing the challenge of the Chinese. I think in the last few years, you poured more concrete than the rest of the world did over the last few years in its entirety, which is where we were 150 years ago during the Industrial Revolution. So there are massive tasks, and I think someone did once say that some of the stuff that we do in smaller countries like ours is a bit like turning up to an earthquake with a dustpan and brush. But if we all turn up with a dustpan and brush, then maybe we can start making some effort here. But it is going to be, we're never going to reduce that carbon footprint to zero. I mean, I noticed, Debbie, you mentioned the idea of carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is a tricky term. It doesn't necessarily mean that things have been reduced to zero, and it's good that you use that term. We are talking about offsetting, but that brings its own problems. I think one thing I would say to the whole audience that my students understand is each time we create a solution, what looks like a solution for climate change, we actually create a new set of problems as well. And I think we're beginning to understand now that it's about balancing and offsetting and maybe trying to find some middle way that begins to make a change, but also accepting that we are not going to stop this. We're not going to reverse it within our lifetimes to a point where it was 30 or 40 years ago. We're going to have to learn to live with some of this as well, a bit like COVID, but on a much bigger scale.
Oh, first mention of COVID. So clearly we need to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings. What about mitigation features to protect against future threats, whether flooding or storms, that kind of thing?
I know, Brian, Denbighshire had some issues with some flooding, didn't you, a couple of years ago with a reasonably new development. It's not going to be possible to avoid building in places where there may be flooding, and particularly as we need more housing, etc. But there are simple methodologies. 3-story houses, for example, some mews houses. I could live in a house where it's 3 stories at the front, 2 at the back with a monopitch roof. If we were to be not going to experience flooding, I'm high up enough, but if we did, it's just a kitchen and a dining room on the ground floor. And you can design houses where there's maybe an incorporated garage and just utility room on the ground floor, which means that the house can cope with, you know, 1.5 meters of flooding, and in the way you design that ground floor to make it relatively waterproof without people necessarily having to be out of their homes for 6 or 7 months, and not living in fear that if there is another flood, then they're going to experience that. So there are things we can do in terms of how we design. I do think we need to look more closely at what we do with our existing building stock, because of course you don't add to the carbon footprint if you're not building a new building. You already spent that carbon, if you like. So making existing buildings work better would work, and that comes back to the VAT point that I mentioned a little earlier on.
Okay, we'll be moving over to Brian next, but just before we do you have any messages for him about local authorities in terms of approving new developments and the sustainability of approved developments?
I think it's really encouraging what Brian said at the start about the declaration of climate emergency. It's something I've been working on at the university, but unfortunately, I'm going to mention it again, COVID rather put the kibosh on that as we all panicked to understand how we could deliver an entire year of lectures online. But we're looking at it being a meaningful climate declaration emergency, so that we look at how we deliver education right the way through. And I think what Brian said is really reassuring, that local authorities are looking at this as a serious thing. It's not just a banner to have across the top of your web page. It needs to be something that visibly impacts on how decisions are made. And I think, you know, with the flooding that Denbighshire did experience a couple of years ago, I should imagine it's a very real consideration whenever planning decisions are now made within the local authority area. We need, beyond, you know, so I'm happy with Denbighshire, but beyond that, we probably need local authorities and government to begin to really think about how do we make better use of the existing cities we have, and do we really maybe possibly need another one somewhere? And I know everyone will start panicking now, but you know, if you actually look on how much of the UK landmass is built, it's something like 4 or 5%. And yet you read the campaigns and you think that we were tarmacked up to the eyeballs. So we probably need to think a little bit more strategically about where we put new things. But brownfield sites in towns and cities should be where we're concentrating first, because the infrastructure is there.
Indeed. Okay, so Brian, if we could come over to you. Clearly your role in terms of managing climate change from the council's perspective needs to bring the local people along with it. So how do you think you're getting on with engaging the local population?
Well, what we did along the trail of the past 2 years, and even with COVID around us, we had one climate change meeting in the Ruthin Chamber, the headquarters of Denbighshire County Council, and I think there was about 80 people attended that, and we followed that up in the autumn of last year with a virtual climate change meeting. So we've opened the doors to a number of groups, climate change groups. We sat and we listened to them, and we've taken on board some of their relevant points. So that's definitely been a good starter for 10. We have got plans, and this is a big one for me, this, of getting on board in schools and dealing with young people, because although it's been said many times that they are the future, and they are on board, they have got a viewpoint, and if you have got them on your side with you, that can spread gospel without getting too religious here. They can help spread the gospel to perhaps some of the more cynical older generation that don't quite grasp it. And I've seen examples where that does work well. One point I did want to mention, without sort of rubbing the point in too much, and hopefully there's not many other authorities listening to this, and Colin's just referred to it, it's the easiest thing in the world to declare the climate emergency and wave the banner. I'll make no apologies again for saying I honestly believe Denbighshire are right on the forefront with what they've done. But one of the point that I did want to make was that in October 2020, Denbighshire changed their constitution, and in that decision, the words now read that whatever we do in Denbighshire, in whatever department, it must have a regard for climate change. And so already today, all reports that come through, whatever avenue of Denbighshire County Council to whatever committee, there is a section in there on having the regard for climate change and implementing whatever that might be where we can. And obviously we stray here now into the realms of cost. John Egan mentioned it earlier from HyNet about, you know, how serious the problem is. And what I say to people, and it's getting a little bit boring now, I look at climate change from where I used to sit in my private sector days and dealing with health and safety. You can relate climate change to health and safety. Now, most people know that get involved in health and safety, cost doesn't come into it. If there's a health and safety issue, the last thing that's considered is the cost, because you have to attend to the health and safety issue that's in front of you and attend to that and solve it, put measures in place, full stop. If we can get that simple message to the organisations, the stakeholders and the people that can organise funding for climate change, it's a pretty simplistic message. If we look at climate change as health and safety, and without getting too dramatic, we're going to save the planet, money should not be an issue. I know it's a bit sort of loose that, but actually it shouldn't be an issue. The funding needs to be found. It can be found. It was found during COVID. Yes, it'll have to be paid for at some point down the line. But if we're talking about saving the planet, it doesn't come into the equation, doesn't it? Does it? We need to do it. So a bit of a point there, going off on a tangent.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Now, 54% of the carbon footprint of the county council is its buildings. What work's going on to address that?
There's quite a lot of work already been done. We've had a couple of officers going round. We've identified our biggest carbon emission building, and measures have been taken to reduce that and simple methods by just altering heat settings. I won't mention the building, but in its broadest terms, altering heat settings is making a vast amount of difference to reducing the carbon emissions. And if you knew the background to it, you'd properly understand that. But so that's what we're doing. We're looking at in the housing stock, and again, Colin sort of alluded to it. In the existing housing stock, they're looking at all box standard methods to reduce the carbon emissions there, solar EV, etc., etc. So there is quite a bit of work going on. We're also in discussion with the North Wales Construction Framework, who are looking at, by nature of what they call frameworks of building going forward. It leans over to 21st century schools, but there is thinking and mythology in there that we can use in housing as well. I think Colin's covered some of the relevant points going forward on what we do need to do with house building in general. That's not in my portfolio, that actually, but
well,
the few things, you know.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Now, a number of questions have come in, but final question directly to you relating to carbon absorption. So to offset carbon emissions, what work is the council doing on that front?
Right. Well, we will unfortunately emit more carbon than the other way round. So what are we doing to combat that? Again, it's box standard stuff. It's not rocket science. We're going to be increasing the woodland cover, and that's already happening now. And we're a long way through planting 18,000 trees, and that will be achieved by 2022. We started that in 2017. So before the bar was raised, there'd already been an acknowledgement in Denbighshire that we had to do something with the woodland cover. There's also 60 or so wildflower meadow projects that have been implemented. So that's another avenue that will benefit biodiversity. So they're the two main things.
Good. Thank you, Brian. Now we have a comment from an anonymous attendee. Brownfield sites can be excellent for wildlife, far better than most agricultural fields, and provide accessible local green wild space for residents. Sounds plausible. Colin, would you agree?
Yeah, it depends on the nature of the brownfield site. And one of my favourite stories from the credit crunch was a building site in Leeds, which was supposed to house a huge tower. And all they'd done was dug out the foundations before the project halted, was turned into urban allotments until the project came back on a few years later. So there is scope. And what you'll notice with more urban projects on brownfield sites is that the coverage of the site is rarely fully a building. It is very much greener. And there's a particular thing called biophilic architecture, which is a love of nature, which is now becoming more of a feature of design. And there's now a new standard that's coming out which measures this. So the greening of spaces is possible. I mean, from my perspective, most brownfield sites, because they sit within an urban area, should be for building construction, but on that basis that you are creating green spaces with them. And when we do talk about standards, and I've noticed I had a quick look scan through the questions as Brian was talking. There's a question around solar panels and lack of uptake. If you can, some of us can cast our minds back to when lifestyle homes came in, so lower window sills for people with wheelchairs, level access into houses, new houses having a downstairs toilet. That used to be a standard people tried to meet. It's now an accepted part of building regulations. So one of the things we can do around solar panels, water butts, all these kind of things we've mentioned, is make them a standard and then absorb them into the building regulations so that no building or house will be built in the future without those features. So there are ways of turning this into an advantage where it becomes part of the construction industry and becomes something that we make and feature. So rather than trying to sometimes look at some of these things like initiatives around solar panels as a one-off thing reliant on government funding, make it part of the building regulations, and then you don't have a choice around it, and the industry will adjust around it, and the costs will come down as they always do when there's more demand.
Good point. Michael Lovegrove has said progress is being made with modern methods of construction, particularly promoted by Wood Knowledge Wales. He's raised the issue of heat pumps that provide heating and cooling potential, so good for winter and summer. And he wants to know whether there are any views about retrofit to existing housing stock.
I mean, we covered that a little bit earlier on. Sorry, Brian, if I just jumped in before you there. I think one of the things we need to start looking at, particularly when we're talking about large estates where we're not going to be demolishing these buildings, is communal systems for energy generation. So a communal heat pump is possible. One of the weird things about the Wrexham project where they put solar panels on is, of course, if your house didn't have a roof that was suitable, didn't point in the right direction, you didn't get any. So your neighbour might get the advantage of solar power and you didn't. So we maybe need to start looking at more communal systems like that. And on my hour and 45 minutes on trains to get from Liverpool to Wrexham, there's a fantastic solar array next to the railway track near just the other side of, I've forgotten the name of the place, Neston, but on the Welsh side. So more projects like that. If we do have areas where we can put, you know, these large arrays down, they become great places also for greening, because underneath the solar panels, creatures and bugs and all this kind of stuff have wild places to live. So there's all kinds of ways that we can look at different projects to support the urban and the suburban, but also to actually look at how we create better ecosystems and environments in and around the area as well. We have post-industrial sites which would make great locations for that kind of stuff in Northwest Wales, Northeast Wales, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Brian, are you wanting to come in?
If I could please, James, just to add to Colin's comment there about policy change, that has got to be the way to make the difference here, because I felt the frustrations locally of trying to make a difference, if you like, on inputting into housing stock and what can be done. And you're fighting a losing battle. It most definitely needs to come from policy change from up on high, and then you'll see the difference. We'll really see it coming through. So we need to push that. My cabinet colleague member, Tony Thomas, who's responsible for housing in Denbighshire, he can push it from his level. And actually, I think he might be on the meeting this morning. He does actually cover biodiversity, which is the woodland cover and purchasing of land, brownfield sites, which we can use to benefit the cause. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes left on this panel. Judith Hickey says she lives in an old house. How can she not be a pariah on the green agenda? It's drafty, but they can't seal it up, as that would damage the fabric. What support might there be for people in old houses?
Yeah, Judith, you pick up on something that I dealt with Gwynedd Council, my home county actually, despite this lack of Welsh accent, about 3 or 4 years ago, where you with some of our housing stock, we are just going to have to accept that you cannot insulate it in the way you might do a modern building. If you've got a stone home, then you can't insulate it on the inside because it loses all the character. You can't do it on the outside because it loses it. So what we need to look at is better systems. So when it comes to the point where your heating system needs to be replaced, it should be looking at, you know, the best system that works for the house. You shouldn't consider yourself a pariah because you're looking after a piece of our architectural heritage as well. But that again is, as Brian was saying, is about policy. It's about having a reactive, not reactive, what's the word before? A proactive set of policies, whether it's in the local authority, within Wales or within the United Kingdom. All too often, our policy in terms of construction, civil engineering, climate change is reactive. And sometimes we overdo the reaction and we don't really think it through all the implications. So please don't ever feel like a pariah. You're a custodian, but there will be things we need to think about how we supply energy to your home, for example, and what can be done in and around the space that you live in.
Okay, thank you. And just to round off this panel, I think we can combine two questions. One from Paul Toll: how can tourism be managed to be more environmentally friendly? And then my colleague Gareth Davis, who represents the constituency in Cardiff Bay, is asking about the Welsh Government decision to suspend building of new roads. We need infrastructure, he's saying, certainly roads until we have suitable alternatives. So tourism would be an example of why we need infrastructure. Stephen, any thoughts on that?
Yep, thanks for that. I actually do some work for the WLGA on tourism, and this is quite a hot issue. I think personally the key to this is more investment in tourist infrastructure, so that we are able to manage visitors a lot better. The second strand of policy to tackle over tourism, as it's perceived, is to try and market and improve secondary offers. So I think the new national park proposed for the Clwydian range would be very helpful in diverting some custom away from Snowdonia. And then within Snowdonia itself, there's a lot more attractions that people could visit. I think the other issue then is sustainable transport into the region and enabling people to travel into the region by train and having connecting bus services and very dedicated services. You know, the hydrogen bus, the electric bus, to get people from the train station to the to the attraction. The other thing we can do is park and ride. So if people do drive, they can park up somewhere where they can recharge their electric car, or you know, we need hydrogen deployed as a fuel, so people can use hydrogen cars, and people can travel in a low carbon way. We've certainly got the assets. And I think the question is about how we manage. So with COVID-19, the Welsh Government set up a hardship fund, and councils were able to apply to that. So they were able to employ wardens to help people and manage crowds. They were able to lay on additional litter picking and additional car parking, because a lot of this is linked to a feeling of over-tourism. But I personally feel that there is not enough local investment in tourism facilities to help people. I'll briefly talk about new roads. If you invest in the condition of a road, you've got a better surface, that there is actually less pollution, and the car runs more smoothly. And it's the same to some degree with congestion. There are some investments that will actually help reduce carbon emissions. So around Aston Hill and the Red Route, that there are cases you could make that it's more environmentally friendly. The other issue is that you can model active travel and bus provision on new investments that can help with transition to low carbon transport, and also accommodate public transport within new investments, and things like junctions and bypasses to help particular communities can still make a contribution to improving the quality of life and the environment. And I don't think we can write off the fact that there'll be a lot of demand for use of roads from cars as we transition from petrol and diesel across to electric and hydrogen. I think people's aspirations will be to have cars, and we still need to think about how we're going to manage those. And those roads will make a huge economic contribution in the future, even as we develop better public transport and different ways of moving around. Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. We've overrun already by 3 minutes, so Brian, very quickly, if you mind.
Right, yeah, just a couple of quick points then off Stephen's comments. It sends a chill down my spine when I hear over-tourism. It comes from a private sector days about turning down business, and it puts a chill right down the spine there. So the effort needs to go into, and certainly in the rural areas, it can be done. It's not rocket science. We can pick up on some of your ideas, Stephen, if we can work with Transport for Wales and put measures in place to transport people from A to B. And then on the infrastructure, the road network, every cloud's got a silver lining. So projects have been shelved, but I did read something that the Deputy Climate Minister is in favour and is open for discussion. And I've got a letter drafted out. All the monies that they're not going to be spending on these new road projects, that money can be shunted off to highway maintenance to chip into the millions of pounds of backlog of work. And hopefully he'll remember Denbighshire when he receives that letter, when it's all formulated up for him. Thank you, James.
Very good. Good to get that in, Brian. So we come to the end of our second panel. A very big thank you to Colin, Stephen and Brian. Again, if you are able to stick around and watch the remainder, that's great. If not, we entirely understand. So thank you very, very much. So the third and final panel, and in this panel, we'll focus on issues relating to our personal environmental responsibilities. The general theme of this panel will be how we must all play our own individual part in reducing carbon emissions and climate change. We'll look at how these emissions impact directly on our health and detrimental impacts they have on the environment around us. We'll look to bring the focus of discussion down to the level of the individual and how we must all change our ways to avoid the most serious impacts that climate change can directly cause. Discussions on climate change often understandably focus on broad global issues and can sometimes appear removed from the daily lives of most people. However, as most of us here this morning can, I'm sure, understand, the threats to our everyday lives and the natural environment on our doorstep that are posed by climate change are hard to overestimate. To discuss these major issues on this panel, we'll hear from Joseph Carter, who is the head of Devolved Nations at the British Lung Foundation and Asthma UK, Adrian Lloyd-Jones from the North Wales Wildlife Trust, and Jonathon Dawes, the first member of the Welsh Youth Parliament for the Vale of Clwyd. And I'd like to invite each of the panelists to give an introduction about themselves. Joseph, do we have you there? I think we do. Good. So Joseph, please fire off. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Sorry, I was in that joining mode where I was booted off briefly, was suddenly upgraded to be a panelist. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the kind invitation to be here today. Having watched the two previous panel sessions, they've been really good, actually really high quality panels, and I hope we can live up to that expectation. So it's a pleasure to be here to represent Healthy Air Cymru and represent my own charity of Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation in Wales. So our interest in this agenda comes from one of trying to tackle air pollution as a direct cause of lung conditions and other conditions such as cardiac issues, strokes, diabetes, and even Alzheimer's. We've known for a number of years now about the links between air pollution and different types of lung conditions. But as the years go on, our understanding grows. We have a better understanding of just how bad it is. And the more we look at, the more we learn, the more horrific it is, and actually the more we realise the huge risks to all of us because of air pollution. So across the UK, it's estimated that between 36,000 and 40,000 people die every year as a result of air pollution. And in Wales, the estimates vary between about 1,400 and 2,000 every year. A lot of these people who die early die with heart conditions, but it's not just those who actually die early who are affected. So it is sadly all of us. It's the child being exposed to air pollution around their school, and because they're low height and they're very early developing lungs, as you know all too well, your previous pre-political question, James, they are very vulnerable, and sadly that means that they are more likely to develop asthma or rarer pediatric lung conditions. We know that children actually in the womb are being affected by this because of the absorption through their mothers at that stage. We know that those people with pre-existing lung conditions suffer from asthma attacks or flare-ups in their COPD because of a sudden pollution spike around them. So it is affecting all of our lungs all the time. We sadly can't stop breathing to avoid it. We can look at where we go and actually making some sensible, practical choices to try and avoid certain hotspots. But sadly, it is very difficult to avoid. And it builds up over time. So a lot of science now are learning about things like dementia, because the pollutants are so small, far smaller than a grain of sand. You're breathing it in, it's coming to the lungs, it's disappearing from the bloodstream, and then going God knows where. And in the case of Alzheimer's, clearly going into the brain and then affecting everything else. So it's a very scary place, but one we're learning a lot more about. So, but there are things we can do, and the reason we were keen to talk about this as a preventative agenda is because there are choices we can take in terms of our own behaviour, be it transport, the way we live, our lives, our homes. I enjoyed the discussion before about housing, and indeed the industry and the world we live in. So lots of things we can do, and there are decisions that we can take both as individuals, through our local authorities, through the Senate, and through obviously for our MPs such as yourself. And internationally, obviously the COP conference, COP26 conference is very important to us. So that's our starting place. But we ultimately want to create a world we can all breathe clean air and have healthy lungs as a result.
Excellent. Joseph, thank you very much. Adrian, can I go to you next, if that's okay? You need to unmute, sorry.
There we go. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. So yes, I'm Adrian Lloyd-Jones. I'm the Living Landscape Manager with the North Wales Wildlife Trust. We are a local wildlife trust. We're one of the 46 other local wildlife trusts that cover the entire United Kingdom. And we manage nature reserves and undertake projects in the wider countryside, in the marine environment and in urban areas. We also work to influence decision makers at the local level, at the regional level and national level, as well as the UK level, to get a better protection and enhancements for wildlife and our environment. And this includes influencing things such as planning decisions, opposing inappropriate development where necessary, as well as working to influence government policy and legislation at both the, at all levels, local, regional, national and UK level. And we are involved in the climate change debate, not only because many of the habitats that we support, both through our nature reserves and working with landowners, not just because those habitats sequester carbon, they're carbon stores, and they also every year sequester massive amounts of CO2, but also because climate change is very likely to adversely affect many of our native wildlife species. And so obviously it's something that we want to limit as far as we possibly can. Another thing that we do is we lead the Welsh Beaver project, which aims to undertake a managed reintroduction of beavers to Wales as a nature-based solution to reducing flooding, cleaning our water, restoring our wildlife, and sequestering carbon, because beavers create and manage wetland ecosystems and are a keystone species that benefit a whole range of other species, and also being something that people are interested in. Also great for wildlife tourism, so it can bring income into wildlife, into rural areas, and help to demonstrate the economic benefits that wildlife can have, not just in terms of looking after our environment, but also in terms of supporting rural economies.
Very helpful introduction, thank you. And Jonathan.
Thank you, James, and thank you for your introduction. Now, it's an absolute pleasure to be here to speak today. It's such an exciting event ahead of the COP26 Climate Change Summit, which is not only going to sway the way that internationally we view climate change, but the decisions being made at that conference are going to impact my generation and generations to come. So thank you again, James, for inviting me to be here today and your team on organising. Now, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jonathon Dawes, and I am the inaugural outgoing member of Welsh Youth Parliament for the Vale of Clwyd constituency, and a passionate environmentalist who, throughout my time in office, I had the incredible opportunity of being able to work with Welsh and UK government ministers, industry experts and civil servants to develop green policies, many of which have become respected government policies and are very much interlinked to the discussion that we are having today. Now, I've always been a strong advocate of personal responsibility when it comes to the environment, because you look at the environmental debate and where it is in Wales and the UK at the moment is when you speak to particularly young people, is it often gets clouded in the theatrics of Extinction Rebellion and those sort of organisations and what goes on, and often personal responsibility is lost in this discussion. Because I think that there is a general consensus amongst a lot of people that it is the role for government to deal with climate change. Now, the government will play an important role in this, but ultimately, from my perspective, is that everyone needs to play their part. And if we're going to get on top of this crisis, and that's what climate change is, it's a systemic issue that's impacting generations, is that all stakeholders in society are going to have to come together, and they're going to have to come up with a solution that's going to deal with this systemic problem. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a role for government, and I think that's really important to mention, but it is going to require everyone in society to do their bit. Me, James, Joseph, Adrian, that's all of us. We're all going to have to do everything we can do. But also it very much links to the traditional idea that I know is very much interlinked with the way we look at politics in this country, and that is of organic society, in the sense that everyone's going to have to do their bit, otherwise the organism as a whole fails. And I think that can very much be linked to the debate we're having today and climate change. Now, combined with global agreements like COP26, if it's making a big change, like buying an electric car, or like me today, wearing an eco-friendly suit from Moss Bros made of plastic bags, we can all do our little bit to make a big impact on the environment through reducing our carbon footprint. And I tell you what, is that personal responsibility is the key to getting on top of this issue. And I think it's the role of policymakers to encourage and equip people to make those better choices. Now, thank you very much, James. I think you've all heard me witter on now for a bit too long. We will certainly get on to the discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to what's ahead.
Excellent, thank you, Jonathan. A reminder again to the audience to submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom. We do have one from Dewi. I'm not sure if that's from the previous panel, but he does refer to meat consumption, which is a controversial issue. We may get to that. Joseph, if I can come to you first in relation to air pollution. You talked about the kinds of diseases that arise from it. So we all know the lungs in particular, heart, brain. Do you have any idea of numbers affected in this country or worldwide by air pollution caused disease?
Oh, okay. Worldwide, no, I haven't got the figures with me. I mean, in terms of the UK figures, as I said, we estimate between 36,000 and 40,000 people die early as a result of air pollution every year. The challenge we have in terms of conditions being caused by air pollution is the causal effect, and it's very disentangling the different factors to determine the diagnosis and the death is very tricky. I mean, a good one, a very simple example might be the link between poverty, air pollution, and smoking prevalence. And a lot of our most polluted roads tend to go through our poorest communities, where our smoking levels are highest. So trying to actually disentangle the fact that someone may well have had a smoking history or even be a current smoker, plus they live on a busy road, plus they may well have worked in the heavy industry, trying to disentangle the exact blame for what proportion of that condition or that death due to air pollution is really hard. So coming up with the figure of 36,000 to 40,000, it's taken years for academics to try and do that, and similarly the Public Health Wales figure of around 1,400 is challenging as well. So we don't know. We do know is the differences is the different types of air pollution and where it comes from. So, for example, in Western economies, it tends to the major pollutants tend to be vehicles, particularly in terms of nitrogen dioxide pollution. But actually, look at for example, India and large parts of Africa. One of the major causes is indoor cooking. Cooking on indoor fires in the home, and actually even in the UK. Domestic burning by burning coal or wood is a major factor in particulate matter pollution, which is one of the more dangerous ones. So it's very mixed. It's a very challenging picture. I think the thing about I would come back to Jonathan's point before about the not all the way suit, although I was very impressed by that point. The point about the kind of how we kind of focus on this and people and thinking about organic change. One thing about air pollution, I suppose, as climate change, is that there's a very direct link now to it. Nitrogen dioxide pollution in particular doesn't tend to travel far, so it's very much clustered around the busy roads where it's coming from, or the industrial complex which is causing it. People can feel, people can actually smell or breathe in the actual effects of that pollution right now. They can see the causal link in a way that you thankfully, I suppose in many ways, can't see the direct climate change link, because actually, thankfully, it's taking years and years for this to come, and actually might be impacting different parts of the world rather than here. So this agenda is one that people can visualize more and actually can see the benefits to themselves right now of making positive changes. And that's really useful because all these things are really important. But if it's the air pollution which can be the motivator for positive change, then that's great.
Yeah, and as you said, it's not just built-up areas, is it, that are affected, because open fires in particular in rural areas are a problem. So, I mean, I know myself because I carried a pollution monitor around the constituency a year or two ago and picked up worrying levels of air pollution in some areas. Do you have a rough idea of the extent of the problem in North Wales compared to other parts of the country?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly most of the pollution problems in North Wales are focused around our major roads. Then, aside from that, you're looking more then into the more industrial parts of Deeside. You know, we do have the benefits of the open spaces to try and clear this. We have the sea breeze. Depending on the wind direction, can be useful. Although sea breeze itself, salt can be a factor in pollution as well. So certainly the pollution in the north is because of rurality is not as bad as down South Wales, but it's still a problem and it's still a major one. And you're absolutely right that we focus a lot on vehicles. It's an easier correlation, but actually in some of our rural communities where you have biomass burning, where you have problems with slurry storage, we have challenges of poultry farming, then all that contributes to the air pollution around. And actually, we've been very one of the more challenging things for us as charities predominantly living in urban areas was to get our heads around when we were working with Welsh Government on the Clean Air Plan, was making sure we got the rural section right, and there was a lot of good engagement with agricultural industries and organisations to try and make sure that was realistic. And simple solutions such as tree planting, slurry storage, slurry capping is really important. So yes, we always make positive changes, both rural areas and urban as well.
Now, Rachel Flynn has queried the impact of the aviation industry, bearing in mind, obviously, there have been fewer flights during the pandemic. I'm not sure that we have the expertise, and I certainly don't, to comment on that. But Joseph, is that something that your charities have been looking into in any respect?
We haven't done a great deal on it. I mean, it is. I mean, we have seen those. We have seen some reports in this area. I mean, aviation tends to be more focused on climate change anyway, because of obviously how high the planes are flying. The actual the air pollution impact is very much limited to the area surrounding the airport, and it's very localized anyway. So it is mainly the climate change factors, but there's definitely been a positive benefit, and how positive we don't know. But the fact remain that we all, by shutting down everything from last March through to last June, had a really positive impact on air pollution across Wales in all aspects. It has crept right back up now, and in some cases, because of people's fears of public transport, there is a risk it will worsen. But actually, it showed that when we make dramatic changes, and we can take an awful lot of nitrogen dioxide out of the atmosphere by not driving our vehicles, and I think that has made a lot of people take notice about their benefits to them, but particularly people with pre-existing conditions like asthma, who actually had a lot less asthma attacks, a lot safer because the roads around them were quieter. So yes, so in terms of aviation specifically, we haven't got those stats for us now.
And finally, at least for now, what would you like to see discussed at COP26 in relation to the health impact of pollution?
I think our big ask for COP is that all governments take the issues of air pollution seriously, and look where they can deal with this on an international basis. I mean, internationally, there are huge problems with shipping. There's a lot of reports about the sort of dirty, toxic secret of our shipping industry, with sulfur pollution in particular. But certainly, as we are looking at post-Brexit trade agreements and thinking about how we export to the rest of the world, we need to look sustainably and think about the air pollution that we're generating, particularly in the agricultural sector. Air pollution, more so than climate change, is an area where we can make important choices ourselves and change things. But there is still, particularly with with particulate matter pollution, we are still impacted by heavy industry coming from Northern Europe and sort of because of the wind directions. So actually, we are reliant on decarbonisation and the cleaning up of industries in other parts of the world to benefit us. So yeah, and obviously we also need the technological investment of all nations into cleaner, greener transport systems, which are more affordable as well.
Great. Well, fingers crossed for later in the year. Adrian, if we could to move to you, talk about deforestation. Now, deforestation in this country, of course, happened a very long time ago, probably, and so it's largely about, I suppose, planting new forests that we'd long since forgotten about. I suppose some comments about that, but also on an international level, deforestation and what you think COP26 should do about it, please.
Well, yeah, so we are a very, very nature depleted country. Well, Wales and the entire UK, very nature depleted, one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And of course, we've come to accept this because we don't know any different. But you go to Europe and you see the wooded hillsides there, where the deforestation didn't occur, and yet people go to, for example, parts of Snowdonia and the Lake District, and they see these bare hills and think they're natural, and they're not natural at all. They should really be wooded almost to the top. In fact, you know, a lot of these hills are not too high for trees. So we certainly do need to restore our biodiversity habitats, and trees and woodland are very important for that. Obviously, there are challenges there with regards to livelihoods of rural communities who've been using these areas for grazing for many, many years. But of course, with all the changes that are occurring and ideas such as public goods schemes coming in to pay farmers and landowners to produce different things, so they can produce carbon landscapes, they can sequester carbon by changing what they do, they can produce clean water by doing likewise. As long as they can get an income from that, then their livelihoods can be maintained, and I think that's very, very important. But we do need to start certainly planting more trees. I believe that the cooling of the climate after the Cretaceous period was, well, during the Cretaceous period was largely due to the evolution of angiosperm trees spreading across the world and sucking up the carbon. So if it did it then, I'm quite sure that more trees will do it now. We also need to connect up our habitats. We need to restore peatlands. Peatlands, as we know, are important carbon stores. And over the years, they've been drained for agriculture, often not very agriculture that doesn't really provide much income. It's usually heavily subsidized, otherwise it's completely uneconomic. And we need to start to re-wetten and re-wood our habitats, which is something that we are very much involved with. So in Northeast Wales, we have our Woodlands for Water project, and we're working with 60 landowners at the moment, farmers and landowners in the Alyn and Chwila valleys, working to restore hedgerows, to plant trees, to create new woodlands, to fence off and plant up riverbanks to provide buffer strips, so that you don't get so much agricultural runoff into the rivers. We're working with the Welsh Dee Trust, we're working with farmers to look at solutions to limit soil runoff from their farms, and we're supporting the farmers in doing this, and they're very supportive of what we do. And in fact, we've got more landowners wanting to be involved, and we've actually got the funding to get involved. And it's been a great project. It's actually funded by the Welsh Government through their sustainable management scheme. And one of the things we've been working on is no fence tree planting, and this involves planting trees on hillsides in particular in such a way that you don't require large areas to be fenced off, which means that these areas are still usable by farmers, they're still open to accept farm subsidies for them, and also they don't stop people enjoying these areas, and it creates what we call in Wales ffrith habitat, which is this nice sort of scrubby scattered trees and taller vegetation that wildlife loves, and provides shelter for grazing animals. So it's really, really useful. And the idea is, of course, is that the more trees we have in our landscape, the more that rainfall gets intercepted. It gets intercepted and transferred to the groundwater. And this basically means that we're slowing the flow of water through catchments. So rather than taking hours, it takes days to reach the mountaintops to the sea. And that means when you do get heavy rain, you don't get this massive pulse of water coming down the catchment, which of course is what causes terrible flooding. You know, in villages and towns like St Asaph, for example, which has been had problems with flooding in the past, and Denbighshire as well. And of course, right across the UK, we know that this is a problem. And nature usually has the solution. And it's good to see the Welsh Government committing to nature-based solutions for managing our catchments in Wales. And I think that's pretty much got all party support. So this is certainly something that we need to do, and something that we are doing. And it's something that I would like to see COP address on a global scale. And of course, in the UK, we've lost a lot of our trees, and we're trying to restore that woodland habitat. Of course, around the world, we have terrible deforestation that's still occurring. To often, you know, to grow crops such as palm oil, and to grow rubber trees, and in South America, there's a lot of clearance of rainforest to produce beef, or to produce the soya to feed beef cattle. And it would be great to see that tackled. I mean, the mechanisms that are available are varied and many, but I would hope that we can incentivize rather than punish to encourage countries to do what they need to do. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're moving on a bit from your area, but you mentioned palm oil, and actually that's really important when it comes to consumer choice, isn't it? And where we shop. I know Iceland, for instance, have had an effort not to use palm oil in their products. Do you think there's more that needs to be done on that front in this country?
There's so much that could be done, and I think one of the a very powerful way of doing this is through awareness campaigns, so people actually are aware of what they're doing when they buy products, where they come from, the impacts that they have. I think consumer-led changes are extremely important. But I also do see a role for government in possibly having environmental taxes imposed on certain products that are particularly damaging to the environment, or particularly bad for carbon emissions. And you know, we've done it with, for example, or tax breaks for products that don't have impacts, perhaps. We do it with road tax on vehicles, and I don't see why we can't do that for other things as well. Of course, a lot of this is very complex and very difficult, and can take a long time. But awareness campaigns can be done very quickly, and changing consumer values and consumer choices can be done relatively quickly with enough of an awareness campaign. And I think that is something that government could certainly help with as well. Even just, you know, asking people to be aware of what they're buying, and you know, make responsible choices, and possibly, you know, have the information available to the public.
Thank you. And Michael Lovegrove has made a comment about slurry. Obviously, that's a concern in terms of pollution of the River Clwyd, for instance. But he's made the point that it can be used as an energy source to neutralise its adverse effects. Is that something that you have much awareness of?
I mean, I've certainly known about biodigesters being able to produce methane, which can be used to power small turbines to create electricity, or used as a supply itself. And I believe that 5 Fords in Wrexham, which is a Cymru Welsh Water sewage treatment plant now has a slurry digester to provide gas, to provide the energy to power that plant. So it's certainly something we should see more of. And in fact, one of the problems we've got in Wales, and it's a big problem, is that we're actually producing more slurry than land can actually take. And so when it rains, this ends up in the rivers and we get over-nutrified rivers, which isn't great for species such as salmon, which require very, very clean, nutrient-poor rivers to survive. It's one of the main reasons why we're failing in our sort of Water Framework Directive objectives, is because of diffuse agricultural pollution. So if we can find a better use for the slurry that we're producing, it would be far better for everybody. You know, it would be a win-win for everybody. The farmers would have somewhere to take and get some income, possibly from from what they produce, and the recipients of the slurry would be getting a resource that is useful, and would ultimately, you know, clean our rivers and produce what are effectively, I suppose, carbon neutral ways of producing energy.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be a positive development. Jonathon, can we move to you if that's okay? I know that through your role in the Welsh Youth Parliament, environmental issues have played a big role. It's something young people are very interested in. When I go to local schools, it's often what pupils want to talk about. Do you think that the current political leaders of today are doing enough?
Thank you for your question, James. I think it's a really important question that often isn't addressed very well. In my opinion, I think that world leaders are certainly changing their attitudes towards climate change and environmentalism. And I think that more is being done. And I think it's hard to put on, is it enough or isn't it enough? But I think they're certainly doing more, and it's a step in the right direction. However, if you asked young people, the ones that you see in schools, the ones that I see on social media and I speak to on a daily basis, they would say no, because the way I see it is I don't think that the global leaders are doing enough to engage young people within the heart of the decision making itself. And I think it's a perception thing. So the reason that young people don't perceive that that leaders aren't doing enough is because young people aren't involved in the decision making itself. So one of the key things I would like to see in the future, and I know that the UK government are leading the way on this because they're doing it for COP26, is that they have formed a panel of young people who are going to work with the leaders at COP26 to influence the policy. So that's certainly a good step in the right direction. But however, on a more general basis, when leaders and ministers are making these key decisions, I think that to get more young people on board, we need to change the perception of how climate change is being dealt with, get more young people's voices round the table, because we know through all the different works that we've done, all of us on the panel, is that young people's voices enrich decision making. They really do add a positive to what we're doing. So the best thing that global leaders could do right now is, when it comes to these big decisions, is get young people round that decision making table.
Very good. I totally agree. What is the feedback you've had from young people about changes they'd like to see that we all make to our lives to thwart climate change?
No, very, very good question. I think that a lot of young people have very different views on this. So, I've been to schools where there's a very, very strong climate presence. They're members of Extinction Rebellion. And then I've also been to schools where I think that young people just want to have an honest conversation about this. Because the issue is because there's such a divide between those two. You've got the passionate environmentalists and the people that, want to make an impact but don't know how. Is I think that we just need to have an open, honest and frank discussion with young people about what they need to do and how they can do it. Because I noted in my opening statements about personal responsibility and often how it's hidden by the theatrics of the environment debate in this country. We've all been on Twitter and Facebook and seen those videos of Extinction Rebellion doing something rather odd in one of their protests, if it's smashing down windows or gluing themselves to the road. And even though it raises awareness, raises awareness of the issue, it doesn't actually provide any solutions. So I think that what young people need is that open, honest and frank conversation about the individual personal differences that they can make. And also, like I said about perception earlier, is that the government really advertising what they're doing and getting young people involved, and then they're going to make those changes.
Okay, something we haven't talked about particularly is people's enjoyment of the environment around them. And obviously you're a very keen tennis player. I mean, as a doctor as well, I know that we need to get people out walking, running, exercising more. Do you think there's more to be done to get people to value their local green spaces?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to give you a little phrase that you can all steal, is if you don't use it, you lose it. And I think that is certainly a phrase that we can look when we see these green spaces. And I think that if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said is that people don't value their green spaces enough. However, because of the way that the pandemic went, where we know that the virus spreaded more inside and we were allowed to, go and socialise outdoors, is I think that people have got a better respect for their green spaces now than they did before. I still think that, there's certainly green spaces in real, James, that we both know, because I think our inboxes have probably been full of litter and all this sort of stuff. So there's still an apparent lack of respect in places, but there's certainly more respect now than there was before. So, but yeah, absolutely, we have to look at green spaces, not just from an environmental perspective, which is obviously absolutely vital with trees and carbon dioxide, but also the human benefits that come with it. Well, to our health and also to our social, physical and mental well-being, that all these things need to be into it as well. But yeah, I think that we certainly need to protect those green spaces because they're great for our health. They're really good from a sporting perspective, because I obviously have the honour of seeing that all the time. And also, as you say, from an environmental perspective too.
Great. Now we've entered the final few minutes really of the whole event. Do the panel have any other points to make or any comments on what they'd like to see specifically at COP26, given that this event is obviously being held specifically in relation to that, to try and guide what the message from the Vale of Clwyd should be to all those decision makers?
Well, first, I'd just like to agree with Jonathon about the importance of green space. We found this, with our nature reserves. We deliberately kept all our nature reserves open throughout the pandemic, obviously with signs for people to behave responsibly. But people were so grateful for that, to have these green spaces to go for. I think the importance of these green spaces for people's health and well-being has been, well shown by the pandemic, really, more than it ever has been. In terms of what I'd like to see at COP, I think I'd certainly like to see some real ambitious strategies to restore biodiversity, especially perhaps our carbon-rich habitats such as woodlands and peatlands, and it would be some binding targets. I think would be a really good idea, and I think that we should be putting a message out that we want to see real commitment on this and some real action plans produced, because otherwise it just does become another talking shop, and we'll be here in another 10 years' time, lamenting that nothing was done. I
think from my point of view, we're very keen to see the UK and the whole of the West lead by example here, and actually come out as world leaders. And I think this is, the world post the end of Donald Trump's presidency seems a lot more positive in this regard, but we can't afford to have another situation where we simply put the blame and put the costs of pollution onto the poorest countries in the world, and obviously the areas where yes, we all accept that China is obviously a major emitter of pollution, which obviously causes climate change and localized air pollution. That's a factor, but we need to lead by example. And if we show the way, particularly as we go on this path for what the future of the UK looks like post Brexit, and create a world, actually create a country that's very much based on a low carbon, aspiring zero carbon economy, where we are taking decisions about our energy. And to come back to the previous panel discussion, some of this might well cost it more in the short term, but there's long-term advantages. If we lead by example, then others will follow. If we simply say, well, we're too small as an island nation, and actually our pollution, doesn't compare to the rest of the world, therefore, what difference can we make? It's about behaviour change, and whether that's, in this case, the behaviour of a whole nation led by the UK government, leading by example. And if we do that, we'll improve the air pollution around us, or benefit immediately from that, but certainly we'll benefit as a society down the line with positive impacts on climate change.
Very rousing words. Thank you very much, Joseph. In fact, thank you also, of course, Adrian and Jonathan, for your excellent contributions to this panel, and all who preceded you. So I'm now going to draw the event to a close, which is great news if you want a comfort break, because we've been going since shortly after 9 o'clock. I'll just say a few words before we do turn off the technology. So we've had some fantastic contributions. They've given me food for thought. I hope same can be said for you. In fact, I know that's the case from feedback we've already been getting through. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to those of you who've stuck with it all the way through. Those who've come and gone because of other commitments, really appreciated. I hope you found it interesting. I'm pleased that you're engaged with climate issues, especially given the COP26 conference in November. I'm sure you will be following it very closely, as I will. I'd also like to thank my team, because clearly originally we were hoping to hold this in person in St Asaph. That wasn't possible because of the pandemic. The wonders of modern technology and the development of Zoom have allowed us to hold it very effectively, I think, today. But even so, still involves a lot of organisation, and Fraser in particular in my office has put an awful lot of work into it. So thank you to him and the rest of the team. Yes, we'll have a round of applause. So once again, thank you for coming. We've now reached the end of this first Vale of Clwyd Climate Summit. It would be great to hold further such events, so I will look at doing that. We have recorded the proceedings, so if you want to watch it all back again, you can. We'll circulate the details on that. But you can also, of course, direct others who weren't here today to watch it if you think they may be interested. So thank you, and let's do all we can to do what we need to do to protect the planet and the locality. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, James.